Good evening. The Eurozone's two biggest economies, France and Germany, are close to stagnation. Well, ministers, employers and employees are all worried, but old policy habits appear to be firmly entrenched, and it's not obvious how leaders can escape the quagmire. Well, growth rates have slumped, living standards are not getting better, and neither economy has evolved in any material sense since pre-COVID times. So how do France and Germany fight back? And who stands to benefit from this stagnant status quo? Well, shortly we'll hear from our reporters in Europe, but firstly, Ali Sultanzada has this report.
Germany and France have long been regarded as the economic and political cornerstones of the European Union, but recent developments are casting doubt on their ability to sustain this role. Economic stagnation in Germany and ongoing political and financial crisis in France are fueling concerns about their impact on the EU stability and economic growth. Germany's economy is facing significant challenges. In 2023, its net contribution to the European budget amounted to approximately 17 billion euros, yet its industrial output has stagnated. Charles Henry Colombier, head of the Competitiveness Division at the Rexecote Economic Research Center, remarked, "Growth in Germany has stalled. The GDP figures for the third quarter of 2024 are the same as 5 years ago." Three key factors contributing to this stagnation include weak industrial competitiveness, high energy prices, and dependence on China. Stefan Kolyak, an economic expert at BNP Paribas, noted that the lack of support for the energy sector exacerbates Germany's challenges. Since June 2021, energy production costs have increased by 7% in the US, 27% in France, and 52% in Germany. The Bundesbank has also revised its growth forecasts, projecting GDP growth of just 0.2% in 2025 and 0.8% in 2026, significantly lower than previous estimates. France, meanwhile, is grappling with its own set of difficulties. Persistent debt crisis and budget deficits are limiting capital accessibility for the private sector, while political instability, marked by internal conflicts and insurrections in major cities, is further undermining the country's economic potential. The closure of two factories by Germany's Bosch company in France earlier this year, which affected hundreds of French workers, underscores the economic interdependence of the two nations. France's former Minister of Economy and Finance warned that a 1% drop in Germany's GDP results in a 0.2% decline in France's economic growth. The economic challenges facing Germany and France have broader implications for the EU. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development recently downgraded its forecast for Germany's growth, lowering its 2025 projection to 0.7%. The EU's overregulation and reliance on traditional industries are further compounding the issue, making euro area products less competitive globally. Global competition, particularly in the automotive sector, has seen Germany lose its dominance to companies like Tesla in the United States and BYD in China. This stagnation is weakening the EU's industrial backbone. The EU's emphasis on regulations concerning energy transition and sustainability has made euro area products more expensive, limiting their competitiveness, noted a recent analysis by Modern Diplomacy. Political uncertainty has added to the economic woes, with the collapse of Germany's coalition government in November 2024 raising concerns about the country's economic policy implementation. Discussions about loosening the debt brake to stimulate public investment are gaining traction but remain contentious. The economic and political crisis in Germany and France present serious challenges for the EU stability. While both nations have historically been pillars of the Union, their current struggles risk turning them into liabilities. Addressing these challenges requires a coordinated approach, balancing fiscal policy adjustments and innovation-driven investment to revitalize their economies and secure the EU's future.
Well, France has its own problems with economic reform and unrest over things like pension reforms. For more on how the French economy is faring, we can hear from Ross Cullen in Paris.
On Wednesday, the French Prime Minister François Bayrou convened members of the opposition for crucial discussions to see if there can be a way forward, agreement between the parties on France's budget. Now, the budget that is currently in force is the 2024 budget because there was no agreement by MPs before the end of last year, and so they rolled over the 2024 budget into this year as a temporary measure, a stopgap to avoid a US-style shutdown because the plans for this year's budget collapsed in December with the ousting of Michel Barnier, the previous Prime Minister, the first time a sitting Premier had been removed by lawmakers since the 1960s. And so François Bayrou, the new Prime Minister, is trying to get as broad spectrum of political views to inform on the budget plans to make sure that the budget will be able to pass Parliament. He has said that he doesn't want to use this special parliamentary tool to force legislation through the National Assembly. He does want MPs to vote on and approve his budget. However, a reminder that he and his ministers and the government are well short of a majority. It is imperative in the National Assembly at the moment in France for the government to be able to rely on votes from the left, votes from the Green Party, from the right, from the far right. They need a broad spectrum of MPs to vote in favour of legislation for it to pass because they are a minority government. And the budget is a crucial measure, and we have already had the left saying that they would like to see changes to the controversial pension reform of 2023. The Prime Minister says he's open to something called adjustments to that. We don't have the exact details of what he means by adjustments. President Macron will be very wary of any idea to unravel that contentious reform, which he regards as an important part of his legacy, but which set off street riots and major mass protests during 2023. So we'll see if there can be any movement on pensions. When it comes to the budget, they have to pass it as soon as possible. As I said, France has the 2024 budget in place at the moment. Going forward for the Prime Minister, the key focus point for next week will be the 14th of January. Every new Prime Minister in France has to make a general declaration, a major set-piece speech in front of MPs, laying out their policy priorities for the new government and the direction of travel. And a warning that 2 days later, there is the possibility that François Bayrou could face next week a no-confidence vote, just like the one that brought down his predecessor, Michel Barnier, in December. I'm Ross Cullen for AnewZ in Paris.
But the big player in the EU has always been seen as Germany. For a picture of the situation there, we can join Trent Murray now in Berlin.
Guy, this latest data has confirmed that Germany's economic output continues to languish. The government statistics office here saying that in 2024, the country's GDP declined by 0.2%. It follows a similar lacklustre result the year prior, 2023's GDP declining by 0.3%. This marks only the second time since 1950 that the economy has contracted for 2 years in a row, and underscores the challenges that continue to plague the world's third largest economy. Now, experts here have warned that the country is facing structural competitiveness issues as German firms that once led in their respective fields struggle against new international competition, particularly from China. Overregulation and red tape, high energy costs, a falling population and lack of digitisation are also cited as key drivers for the economic downturn. Meanwhile, the road ahead in 2025 also looks bumpy. The country's Reserve Bank predicts growth of just 0.2% this year. But with global tensions remaining high and the prospect of President-elect Trump hitting EU exports with tariffs, economists have warned that even this meagre growth target remains uncertain. The latest news will likely make for difficult reading for German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who faces a tough re-election bid next month. Already behind in the polls, his main opponent, Conservative leader Friedrich Merz, has leapt on these latest numbers, claiming that the policies of Scholz, particularly when it comes to climate protection, have put Germany's long-held place in the world as an industrial powerhouse in jeopardy. Trent Murray for AnewZ, Berlin.
Okay, well, let's explore this now in a bit more detail with our very own Phil Churm, who's coming to join us. Phil, what on earth is going on? For as long as I can remember, these two economies, France and Germany, have been the powerhouses, the superstars of the EU economic system. Where did it go wrong?
It's not so much where it went wrong as the phase that it is going through right now. And France and Germany, yes, you're right. They've always seemed to be the absolute pillars of the EU, both economically, industrially. But there are certain factors coming into play. If we look at the two countries individually, manufacturing, for example, is very much down in Germany because they've seen so much more competition from China, from the United States, and so on. Energy costs in Germany have soared, so that's going to affect manufacturing as well. And that's largely as a result of the war between Russia and Ukraine. They used to get so much of their cheap gas from Russia. They can't do that anymore. So that affects both ordinary citizens, but also industries themselves. And they have an aging population. Their population is getting older. So they're no longer within the actual workforce, but it's also that they become more independent. So it's become more expensive in that way. France has two major problems. One is inflation. It's been battling inflation for quite some time, but it's also been battling for some time against a massive debt, which it's desperately trying to get down. That is mixed with the fact that the country has quite tight labour regulations, which is something that Emmanuel Macron is trying to tackle without going into too much of a fight with workers. But nevertheless, the fact that things like the age of retirement and other labour regulations have meant that some industries have not performed as well.
It's very difficult, I suppose, for politicians, Phil, because so many of the options possibly available to them to raise tax receipts, to do things with fiscal policy that might stimulate a little bit more economic growth. So many of those options are going to be very politically unpopular.
They are, yes. And particularly in France and Germany, Macron has got to be able to try and favour some support with the country. We're in the post-Merkel era in Germany. Chancellor Scholz has a slightly different view and perhaps doesn't carry the same weight as Angela Merkel did, not just in the country but across Europe as a whole. And that the whole personality of that has been an instrumental factor in affecting it all. But the differences in the various levels of growth are quite significant. If we look at Germany's predicted growth by the Economic Cooperation, Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, they're predicting just a 0.7% increase. That's really quite small, particularly when we then compare that to other countries. For example, the United States is expecting somewhere between 2 and 2.5%. China, 4 to 4.5% growth. Now these are the kind of economies that not just France and Germany, but the whole of Europe are going to be having to compete with, and that makes it quite difficult.
To what extent do you think this necessitates a political rethink in these big European economies, Phil? We can see a sea change at the moment in terms of the incoming president of the US, President-elect Trump. We've seen some different points of view across Western Europe recently. How closely connected is political difference, a new approach to politics, and also this sense of economic stagnation?
I think there is a very close link between the two. But both the major leaders, both Macron and Scholz in Germany, they're under a huge pressure from two different directions. internally from their own electorate, who are keen that they make a greater success of the economy, but don't change things like labour laws, like access to social services and health and all those other various benefits, which they may need to do if they're to change the economy radically. On the other side, they're under pressure from other members of the European Union, certainly countries in the south and the east, and Spain and Portugal and Greece, are all looking to those two big economies to be able to help them out too. They've been very much kind of relying on that. Now, if that isn't happening, they're going to have this external pressure. So there'll be some of these countries, both within the EU, that are going to be pushing both France and Germany to make political changes, and those are not going to be popular inside the country.
How long do you think this is going to go on? Are we going to see this crisis, this sense of inertia, continue over the next 12, 24 months? Or are you hopeful that something new, something positive will happen to shake these two great economies out of this quagmire they seem to be stuck in?
I think it will be unlikely to see any major changes in the next 24 months because of these, to introduce some of the social and economic changes that need to take place in both Germany and France are going to take more time than that. They're going to take several terms of parliaments. We also have to think about how the energy issues, which have been so costly for both France and Germany over the last 2 years, the impact that they've had. And while both countries, particularly Germany, have put this great emphasis on trying to increase their amount of homegrown renewable energies, they're not there yet. So that's going to take more than a couple of years as well. So it may well be that they have this particular slump within for a couple of years. I think it then depends on the kind of relationships that they can continue to nurture with the new president and the new administration in the United States, and indeed other countries moving further east as well.
Well, Phil, it'll be certainly very, very interesting to keep tracking this as we go. Thank you, as always, for coming in and for your analysis. Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of News Hour. Please do stay with us on AnewZ for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here on the team in Baku, we wish you a very pleasant evening ahead.